Hi, it's nice to be here. My name is Marcie O'Connor, and today I'm going to talk to you about this big restoration project that my husband Mike and I are doing in western Wisconsin. I'll show you what our land is like and the kind of restoration we're doing, and some of the plants and animals that we see. Western Wisconsin is part of what's called the driftless area, a part of the Midwest that was never covered by glaciers. As a result, the landscape is very rugged with steep hills and narrow valleys. Before the Europeans settled here in the mid-1800s, it was covered with a mix of prairie, savanna, and oak woodlands, with spring-fed creeks in the valleys surrounded by wet prairies and sedge meadows. When the settlers came, they farmed the flat tops of the hills and drained and farmed the flat valley bottoms. In 2000, my husband and I bought an old farm here and decided that it would be fun to try to restore it back to that older landscape: prairie, savanna, woodland, and wetland. I had done small restorations in our city yards, but had no experience at all with anything larger than that. We were pretty naive. We had no idea how much work it would be, how much we would have to learn, or how long it would take. We figure it's a 150-year project, so we still have quite a long way to go yet. Our land had been a farm since the 1850s, most of that time as a dairy farm. When we bought it, the cows had been gone for about 25 years. The crop fields were rented to a neighboring farmer, and the land was rented to hunters. This is what it looked like that first summer. 150 acres of it was cropland, which was being planted in a rotation of corn and soybeans. Another 250 acres or so was woods. Some of it, like this, had once been savanna. And then there were other places that were either oak or maple and oak woodland. This is a north-facing slope with mostly sugar maples. All of the woods had been logged at one time or another. There's a spring-fed creek running through with a large wetland surrounding it. Some of the wetland had been drained and planted with crops. Other parts, like this one, were still wet and had either native wet prairie or sedge meadow. The very first thing we did was to plant all that cropland into prairie. We did about 20 acres a year, so it took us 8 years. This is one of the 20-acre fields when it was still a soybean field. And this is the way that field looked last summer. We also started working on clearing the savannas and oak woodlands of the brush and trees that had grown up between the oaks. This is an ongoing project. There's so much woods, and so much of it should be more open than it is. This was one of the first places we worked on. A grove of aspens and birch trees had grown up, and the understory had filled in with honeysuckle and buckthorn. Dan Carter's talk yesterday about oak woodlands was very helpful. It helped me realize that some of the places that we're clearing are more like oak woodland, and then some are more like savanna. We have 5 bluff prairies on south-facing points. Most of them had been invaded by thickets of brush and trees. This is a photo of one of them from 2004. By then, we'd cleared some of the invaders in the middle of the prairie, but the east and west-facing slopes were still overgrown with birches and aspen that were shading out the prairie plants. We've now cleared the sides of the hills, so now the side slopes are prairie, and the top gets a lot more sun. This is the way it looked last summer. It was a very good summer for Monarda. When we restore these remnants, I usually don't plant any seeds right away. I really like to see how much comes back on its own. After it's recovered for a few years and I see what's there, I add seeds of plants that either grow in other prairies on our place or in nearby prairies. We have just a few mesic prairie areas, flat places that had been grazed but never plowed. This is the largest one. It's about 2 acres. The photo is from 2000, the summer we bought the land. There were prairie plants growing under the trees and brush, but since this was right at the beginning of our project, we really didn't know what to do with it. So we just started mowing. We mowed everything except the trees once a year, every spring for many years. And the prairie plants came back. About 5 years ago, we decided we needed to cut down the small trees. Most of them were apple and wild cherry. They were sprinkled all through the prairie plants. And here it is without the trees. I've never planted anything here. This is one of our most diverse remnants, and one of my favorite places. We also wanted to work in the wetland. There's about 50 acres of it stretching out on both sides of the creek. At the beginning, it felt pretty overwhelming. Much of it looked like this, with wild parsnip and reed canary grass and not much else. I've been working my way across, pulling parsnip, planting wetland seeds, and trying to discourage the reed canary grass. Most parts of it are looking better. This is that same field now that I just showed you, now that the parsnip is gone. Now I'd like to take you on a tour through the seasons at Prairie Haven, with more pictures of the places and some of the plants and animals that share this land with us. The part of the project that I've enjoyed the most is observing and learning about the plants and animals. I have a background in botany, so I knew quite a bit about the plants, but not much about animals. It's been wonderful to have my eyes open to so many different inhabitants of this world that we're living in. I hope you'll enjoy seeing some of them. So, starting in the winter, this is the way our land looks from the road, looking north across the wetland between two of the bluffs and into our center valley. This is the creek. Since it's fed by numerous springs, it never freezes. This is a northern shrike, a winter visitor that we don't see very often. For me, these are often the first sign of spring. They're small day-flying moths called infant moths. They start emerging in mid-March, and sometimes on warm spring days, we see dozens of them sucking up salts from our gravel driveway. This shows an adult with its wings spread, a caterpillar on its host plant, a birch leaf, and two adults resting on a birch twig on a cold spring morning. They're pretty well camouflaged except when they open their wings. Here's an early butterfly, a morning cloak. Since these butterflies overwinter as adults, they are often out flying as soon as the weather warms a little bit in the spring. I haven't seen any yet this year, and today winter's back. It's snowing, but they should come out pretty soon. This is one of the tiniest and earliest flowers I see on the steepest and sandiest remnants, with an early bee. The plant is called common whitlow grass. It's a mustard, not really a grass, and it's only a few inches tall. The bee is a lasioglossum, a sweat bee. This is a pasque-flower, another one of the early spring blooming prairie plants. Historically, there were pasque-flowers here, but the area where they grew was plowed up many years ago. A few years ago, I collected seeds from a nearby prairie and planted them on some of our bluff prairies. So now every year, a few more plants come up and bloom. We have bloodroot, especially growing along the edge of our north-facing woods. And hoary puccoon. This is very common in our bluff prairies. And smooth serviceberry, a very early flowering small tree. Here is spring coming to the Center Valley. Scarlet tanagers arrive pretty early in the spring, and they nest in the woods. During warm weather, I put out lights at night for a few hours about once a week to attract moths so I can learn which species we have. So far, I've identified and photographed more than 1,000 species of moths. I'm still amazed at how many species we have here. and I'm still finding new ones. This is a Luna moth, one of the spectacular giant silk moths. This is a juvenile dusky wing on Hoary Pucoon, one of the earliest of the skipper butterflies. And a Cranesville miner bee. This is one of the bees that Heather mentioned in her talk about specialist bees. This one's a specialist on wild geranium. This is a one-eyed sphinx, another one of the beautiful moths that come to my lights. And a snowberry clearwing moth, another day-flying moth. These are often called hummingbird moths because they look and act like small hummingbirds. It's nectaring on wood betony. Blue-eyed grass. This is another spring blooming flower on our bluff prairies. And a pair of eastern tail blues. Violet wood sorrel. This grows in open woodlands and savannas. This is one of the woodlands that we've opened up with hoary pucoon and tinker's weed. Yellow stargrass. It's actually in the iris family. It's not a grass. It's another spring plant of open woodlands. And showy orchis. We have 11 species of native orchids. Most of them are small and not very common. This is one of the commoner ones. It blooms in the woods right at the end of May. These are wild lupine and golden alexanders in one of the planted prairies. We have lots of tree frogs. This one was watching me from a branch as I was working in the woods one day. It didn't want to be photographed. I would get out the camera and it would slowly slide around the branch so I couldn't see it. And then I would go around the other side and it would slowly slide the other way. Prairie smoke, which are actually the seeds of this flower. This is a dreamy dusky wing. It's a not very common skipper butterfly. Gorgon checker spots. This is considered a species of special concern in Wisconsin, but it's quite common here. Here's a drone view of the creek with the wetland around it. You can see how much the creek meanders and how large the wetland is around it. This is another one of the bees that Heather mentioned in her talk, an alum root cellophane bee, a specialist on prairie alum root. The bright orange that's on the bee's legs is the orange pollen it's collecting from the flowers. This is a pair of little wood satyrs. And a katydid nymph in the genus Scuderia. They're such strange alien-looking creatures. And a striped hair streak, one of the less common hair streaks. These are morning cloak caterpillars. The caterpillars are gregarious when they're small. They feed in pretty large groups. I often find groups like this on shrubby willows in the wetland. As they grow, they separate and feed in smaller groups and eventually by themselves. And here's some angelica growing along the creek. This is a very weedy area with lots of reed canary grass, but it doesn't seem to be a problem for the angelica. Angelica seems to be able to compete just fine with reed canary grass. Butterfly weed is a wonderful flower for attracting butterflies, especially fritillaries and hair streaks. These are great spangled fritillaries. This is green milkweed, a milkweed that grows on our bluff prairies. And here's a close-up of the flowers. I love the way these flowers look when you look at them closely. And we have black bears, not very many, but they do come wandering through. This is a brown wasp mantid fly. It looks like a cross between a praying mantis and a wasp, but it's actually not closely related to either one. It's more closely related to lacewings. I usually find them on flowers where the adults catch and eat small insects, and probably also eat nectar and sap, or pollen, is what I meant to say. They're very small, only about an inch long. And here's an Edwards hair streak on wood lilies. Another hair streak, an Acadian hair streak. It's not a very common one that lives in wetlands. Here's a Henslow sparrow. These are listed as threatened in Wisconsin. They nest in our largest prairie area, which is about 80 acres of planted prairie. And a juniper hair streak. This little hair streak is quite uncommon. This is the only one I've ever seen here. And white camas, a special concern plant in Wisconsin. It grows in our bluff prairies. There's a bee that specializes on this plant, and I'm going to look for it this year. Now that I know more about specialist bees, I'm hoping to find some more of them. This is another special concern plant, snowy campion. It grows in wetlands, often in places that are overgrown with taller and more aggressive plants. The flowers hang face down, so they're pretty hard to spot and also hard to photograph. A clay-colored sparrow on white wild indigo. These sparrows nest in our big planted prairies. And this is a spotted thyris, a tiny day-flying moth. It's about the size of a housefly. This one is resting on lid plant. Here are some prairie flowers that I planted in a dry area near our house. You can see monarda, spotted bee balm, hoary vervain, and partridge pea. This is a cuckoo bumblebee, probably Bombus citrinus on hoary vervain. This is one of our bluff prairie remnants with lead plant, monarda, and prairie dropseed. I've done some clearing here, but you can see there's a lot more to do. A Halloween pennant. Mike has a drone and he takes these wonderful photos of our land from the air. Here in the foreground, you can see one of the bluff prairies with savanna around the edges. On the top, in the back, and in the two valleys on the right and the left are planted prairies. And you can see how much woods we have. There's a lot of it. This is poke milkweed with 2 great spangled fritillaries and a couple of monarch caterpillars. I didn't see the monarchs when I took the photo. It's hard to see them, just their heads are showing, but you can see where they've partly eaten some of those leaves. This is called a 9-bark angle, Macaria abruptata. It's a small moth whose caterpillars eat only the leaves of 9-bark. I reared this one from a caterpillar. This is one of the pretty diverse parts of the wetland with Joe Pye weed, boneset, blue lobelia, flat-topped aster, and wood betony, or swamp betony. Baltimore checker spot butterflies, and there are a few silvery checker spots in there, gathered on a pile of coyote scat. And this is a little later in the summer. Baltimore checker spot caterpillars have hatched and built a silk nest around the top of a turtlehead plant. You can see the caterpillars crawling around the outside of the nest, feeding on the turtlehead leaves and the flowers. Here's another part of the wetland that used to be mostly wild parsnip. Now there's Joe Pye weed, swamp thistle, cup plant, swamp betony, and sawtooth sunflower. And a very odd little day-flying moth, a Virginia creeper clearwing moth. It's probably a wasp mimic. Slender-leafed false foxglove, Agellinus tenuifolia. This likes disturbed places in the wetland, so it grows along the edges of paths and along the sides of the driveway. This is one of the bluff prairies with world milkweed and lead plant blooming. Tiger swallowtails on purple Joe Pye weed. And of course we have white-tailed deer, lots of them. This is blood milkwort, Polygala sanguinea. A red-belted bumblebee, Bombus rufocinctus, see if I pronounce that right. This is a newly emerged queen on showy goldenrod. And here's another of Mike's drone photos, early morning mist in the valley. Here's a monarch caterpillar on world milkweed. We don't see monarch roosts very often. This was a cool, windy day during their fall migration, and we found 5 or 6 roosts like this. They were all in trees along the edges of the prairies where they were sheltered from the wind. And ghost pike, a flowering plant that's parasitic on fungi. When they're fresh, the flowers are white or pinkish and droop down, but as they age, they straighten up and turn dark. Here's a mated pair of giant swallowtails. We see giant swallowtails quite often, but this is the only time I've ever seen a mated pair. And a southern dog-faced butterfly, This is a southern butterfly that occasionally flies up as far as Wisconsin. This one was unusually far north. Normally, they only get to the very southern part of the state. If you look at the sun shining through the top wings, you can see part of that dog face. This is the edge of the wetland with a planted prairie beyond and a restored savanna beyond that. The yellow flowers are sawtooth sunflowers, and there are also Joe Pye weed and boneset in the foreground. We see otters in the creek. We see them more often on trail cameras than in person. And we see sedge wrens in the wetland. They nest in the wetland. Rough blazing star, stiff and showy goldenrod in our big music remnant. This is more rough blazing star with 3 monarchs and 3 painted ladies on it. It's a very good flower for attracting butterflies in the late summer. This is a common buckeye on showy goldenrod. This is another butterfly that's common farther south, but not here. It's a common checkered skipper. I see just a few of them every year, always in the late summer. This one is on silky aster. These are northern flower moths, unusual moths, and this is very far north for them. We have a small population living on one of our steep bluff prairie remnants. The adults fly only for about a week in early September. These 2 are on sky blue aster. This is a golden borer moth, another unusual moth. The caterpillars live inside the stems of bottlebrush grass, and sometimes in later instars, they switch to the stems of either lilies or mayapple. The adults come to my lights at almost exactly the same time every year, within a few days of September 15th. These are migrating monarchs on showy goldenrod. And fringed gentian in the wetland. This is an unusual plant that I never knew we had until last summer when I found it growing in our wetland. It's called grass of Parnassus. We have barred owls that nest in our valleys. This is a trail through one of those wooded valleys. An American lady butterfly on New England aster. It's hard to take photos of snakes that show the whole snake, so this is the best I could do. We met this one when we were walking down a steep path on a sandy bluff. It was as surprised as we were. It did a very good cobra imitation by flattening not just its head, but its whole body and hissing and flicking its tongue. So you can see it looks about twice as wide as the snake actually was. It was pretty scary. This is one of our restored savannas in the fall. This is a very small orchid that blooms in September and October. It's called October Ladies' Tresses. This is the very northern edge of its range. Field thistle. This is one of the beautiful native thistles with male half-black bumblebees. This was one of the last flowers still blooming last fall, and all the bumblebees were clustered on it. This is another odd little orchid that blooms very late, autumn coral root. It's parasitic, which is why it's pink and not green. The flowers are tiny and they only seem to open for a very short time. And there's a fall planted prairie. A sharp-shinned hawk, I think. We see both sharp-shinned and Cooper's hawks, especially in the winter. Sometimes it's hard to tell them apart. These are oak trees on one of our restored savanna hillsides. In the winter, we often see golden eagles. They fly down from northern Canada, and they seem to especially like the hills and valleys of the driftless area. Here's one of the bluff prairies with frost on some of the plants. Bobcats are pretty common around here, but we see them mostly on the trail cameras, not with our eyes. This is a trail camera photo. This is that same planted prairie. It's my favorite one, so there are lots of pictures of it. And these are sawtooth sunflowers in the winter. That's all I have for you. If you'd like to learn more about what we're doing or have questions about it, here's the link to our website. It has a lot more photos, more detailed explanations of our projects, and information and pictures about most of the plants and animals that we've found. There's contact information on the website too, so do feel free to contact me if you have comments or questions. I'd love to hear from you.